Humble mother couldn't buy bread for her daughters until a millionaire showed up and changed everything. That cold December afternoon in Madrid, the sky felt heavier than winter itself. Isabel walked the streets clutching her threadbare coat around her. She had $3.50 in her hand and two 8-year-old twin daughters who hadn't eaten bread in 3 days. She stepped into the bakery as if entering a cathedral. The smell of fresh bread was almost torture. She counted her coins once, twice, 3 times. The baker, used to her weary look, offered, "Just take it." She refused, with a firm, proud look. She walked out empty-handed, holding only her daughter's hands. Malu whispered, "Do you think Santa knows we just want bread with chocolate?" Across the street, in a luxury car stuck in traffic, a man watched. Eduardo Navarro, 42, a millionaire hotel magnate. There he sat, and he saw something he'd never forget. A mother turning down food out of dignity. It shook him. He was used to seeing numbers, not people. But this woman, she didn't beg. She just walked, hungry, brave, and with 2 little girls smiling at nothing. Eduardo stepped out of the car, went into the bakery, bought a bag full of bread, loaves, pastries, holiday cookies. He walked back over to her. Isabel eyed him suspiciously. He handed over the bag and said only, "A Christmas gift. I have a twin sister too. I thought of her when I saw your daughters." Isabel didn't want to accept it, but the girls were already looking at the bread like it was treasure. She relented. She thanked him with a look stronger than any words. Eduardo asked her name. She told him, and the basics: single mom, abandoned while pregnant, 3 jobs, no days off, a life built on sacrifice. But there she was, standing tall, smiling at her daughters. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of her with those coins, her proud refusal, her hungry but happy girls, it pounded him from the inside. For the first time, Eduardo felt all the money in the world was worthless next to the strength of that woman. The next morning, he made a decision, and that's when everything started to change. The next day, Eduardo woke before sunrise. He couldn't get that woman off his mind. Not pity, something deeper, something that troubled him. How could someone have so little and still hold her head high? He asked an assistant to find out who Isabel was. When the reports came back, he felt ashamed, not of her, but of himself. Isabel got up at 4 a.m., dropped the girls off with the neighbor, took 2 buses to clean luxury apartments until noon. In the afternoon, changed into her hospital scrubs and cleaned there. At night, cared for an elderly woman in a distant neighborhood. 3 jobs, 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. And still, she barely covered the rent on a 300-square-foot studio. No rest, no leisure, just sacrifice, survival. Eduardo sat in silence for minutes. He thought of his own life, drivers, champagne meetings, dinners that cost more than Isabel made in a month. For the first time, it all felt hollow. He had to do something, not out of charity, but because it was right. He went to her building, an old block with no elevator, peeling walls, knocked on her door. Isabel answered, surprised, still in her hospital uniform. Eduardo took a deep breath and said what he'd rehearsed all night. "I'm opening a new hotel here in Madrid. I want you to work for me, not as a cleaner, as head of household affairs. I need someone with your outlook, your strength." Isabel froze, as if he spoke a foreign tongue. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No, I saw how you care for your daughters. I saw you turn down alms. People like you are rare, and I need you by my side." She laughed nervously, thinking it a scam. But the girls, eavesdropping behind her, ran to him and wrapped their arms around his legs. "Mom, it's the bread man." That simple, unexpected moment broke down Isabel's walls. She didn't trust easily, but there was something about this man that felt genuine. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked with respect. She hesitated, thought of the bills, the buses, the back pain, and she said yes. The next day, she packed her few belongings and her many fears. Eduardo sent a car to pick them up. When they arrived at Hotel Navarro Madrid, the girls ran through marble halls like they'd stepped into a castle. And Isabel looked around and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The first night at the hotel was silent. The girls fell asleep quickly, enchanted by the soft pillows and the chocolate left on their beds. But Isabel sat on the sweet sofa, staring out at the city, as if something inside her was still stuck outside. That couldn't be real. The next morning, she put on the simplest clothes she owned. She walked into the housekeeping department with her head down and her heart pounding. But she didn't find luxury. She found respect. Eduardo had been serious. She wouldn't be just another employee. He wanted her to lead the team responsible for everything that made the hotel feel welcoming: rooms, organization, routines, well-being. At first, Isabel doubted every gesture. She thought she'd be fired at any moment, that someone would say, "Sorry, it was a mistake." But the days passed, and she proved who she was. She created systems. She organized shifts. She turned chaos into efficiency. She used the experience of someone who always had to make a lot out of almost nothing. Within a few weeks, the hotel began running more smoothly, quieter, cleaner, more humane. The guests themselves commented on it, and Eduardo watched, at first from afar, then more up close. He'd pass by the service area and see her solving problems calmly, swapping shifts for sick staff, covering gaps without fanfare, leading with empathy. It impressed him more than any MBA. The girls were flourishing too. Malu learned to swim in the hotel pool. Alba started drawing the housekeepers as princesses with magic brooms. At night, they sometimes dined with Eduardo. He laughed at their stories as if they were his own. And in a way, they were becoming that. But Isabel still carried her fear, the fear of believing. One night, while she was organizing spreadsheets on the hotel laptop, Eduardo found her in the suite's kitchen, crying silently. She tried to hide it. She couldn't. "What's wrong?" he asked. It's hard to believe this is real." "Why?" "Because when life drags you down for too long, you learn not to trust when it reaches out a hand." Eduardo didn't answer. He just stayed there, present. And in that silence, something shifted. She was still afraid, but now there was someone who wouldn't back away from it. And that, small as it seemed, was the start of a new story. 3 months had passed since that first loaf of bread. Gradually, Isabel and her daughters stopped being visitors at the hotel and became part of it. Isabel transformed the team's routines. She organized more humane schedules, trained staff with patience, created a culture of care that had never existed there. Not because it was her obligation, but because she knew, through experience, what it meant to work exhausted, invisible, forgotten. Eduardo watched with growing admiration. At first it was just respect, then curiosity. Now something harder to explain. He found himself choosing to have lunch in the break room with the staff just to hear Isabel recount how Malu had choked on a button, or how Alba had confused sugar with salt and ruined an entire cake. He laughed as if he'd lived it himself, and in a sense, he was living it now. The girls called him Uncle Doo-Doo. He taught Malu to ride a bike. He took Alba to buy art supplies. When one of them ran a fever, he cancelled a meeting to pick her up from school. And he did it without announcing it, without an audience, just because he wanted to be there. And it was then he realized that this place was no longer just a hotel. It was an improvised home, a home he'd never had. But it wasn't all roses. Behind the scenes, the family holdings board was putting on pressure, Hotel Navarro's costs were too high. Above average wages, extra benefits, service standards that required more people, more time, more care. To them, it spelled waste. First came warnings, then the numbers. Finally, the decisive meeting. Either Eduardo cut costs by 40%, or he'd lose control of the chain. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced the hotel's silent corridors like a man torn in two. He passed the laundry room, where he saw a housekeeper smiling at a guest who'd lost a blouse. He walked through the kitchen, where Isabel, exhausted, was serving tea to an elderly guest. He stopped by the playroom, where Malu and Alba were asleep in each other's arms. Standing there, surrounded by it all, he understood. The hotel did make a profit, just not the kind the board wanted. It made another kind of profit, one you couldn't put on a spreadsheet: peace, belonging, love. And for the first time in his life, he knew what choice he would make, even if it cost him everything. The day of the decision, Eduardo walked into the boardroom knowing he wouldn't walk out the same. They got straight to it. Immediate cuts, staff reductions, sentimental excesses had to go. Profit needed to breathe. And if he didn't have the stomach to do the dirty work, someone else would. Eduardo took a deep breath. He looked at those faces that only saw numbers. And, with a terrifying calm, he said 3 words. I'm out. Silence. Then disbelief. Then chaos. He walked out of there, leaving behind more than a company. He left an empire built over generations. He gave up the billions, the CEO title, the last name that sealed deals. And in doing so, he gained a lightness he'd never felt. That same day, he went to find Isabel. She was in the laundry room, folding towels with her usual efficiency. He paused at the door. He knew what he was about to say would change everything, or end it all. I quit everything. She turned, confused. The hotel, the business, the fortune. I walked away from the holding. I'm out of the world that made me forget what matters. Isabel frowned. She didn't get it. I want to build something new, a small hotel chain, humane, based on real care, on people, not spreadsheets. But I don't want to do it alone. Silence. The kind that seems to pull the air back in. I want you as my partner, Isabel. She took a step back. She thought she'd misheard. Partner? I didn't even finish high school. But you know people, for real, and you can't learn that in any college. She wanted to laugh, to run, to say, this is crazy. But in that moment, the girls ran into the laundry room. They were holding a piece of cardboard they'd drawn on. A little house with hearts in the windows. Above, in uneven letters, Casa. It's the name of our hotel, Mom. We came up with it together. Isabel looked at the drawing, then at Eduardo, and for the first time, she believed. Her answer came without hesitation. Let's get started. 2 years had passed since that winter in Madrid. The first Casa Hotel's location opened in a renovated old home in the Spanish countryside. No over-the-top luxury, no gleaming marble, but the smell of cake at breakfast, fresh flowers in every room, and staff who knew each guest's name. Isabel ran everything, from guest relations to the heart of every detail. What started small became a movement. 5 properties opened. A waiting list of guests, curious investors trying to figure out how a hotel with no ostentation could have so much soul. Eduardo had changed. Lighter, more present, less owner, more member. He swapped suits for simple shirts, icy board meetings for chats with staff in the courtyard, and where there'd been loneliness, there was life. Malu and Alba grew up in a home they'd never imagined. They learned English from guests, planted mint in the hotel garden, made handmade welcome cards. They called Eduardo Dudu. No uncle, no formality, just Dudu, as if he'd always been there. That afternoon, in the garden of the flagship hotel, While the sun gilded everything in calm light, the girls ran up to Isabel and Eduardo, holding a recycled paper sign, "Welcome to Casa, here we're all family." Time seemed to stand still. Eduardo looked at Isabel. She smiled, tears in her eyes, and right then, with no audience and no grand production, he knelt. No ring, no rehearsed speech, just his heart on display. "Isabel, you showed me what home is. You taught me that loving someone is building a place where they can stop being strong all the time. Will you marry me?" She didn't answer with words. She just yanked him up and hugged him so hard, it felt like the world could crumble around them, and they'd still be safe. Eduardo looked at the girls, still on his knee. "Can I officially be your dad?" They both leapt at him, screaming, "Yes," laughing and crying all at once. In that moment, there was no fortune, no inheritance, no contracts. Just a man who discovered that being truly rich is when love becomes home, and home becomes family.